I'm Kerry, the Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. But I'd like to first of all invite our Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Michael Spence, to come up and say a few words about China and why it is important. Michael.
Thank you very much. I suppose my job is really just to talk about why China is important to the University of Sydney. China is important to the University of Sydney not only because so many of our staff and students are fascinated by that country, but because we have 160 people across the university who work on modern China in one way or another. 160 people, and what's particular about that is they're not just sinologists in the old-fashioned sense. They're engineers, doctors, lawyers, social scientists of various kinds, people in the humanities who are interested in what's going on and what has gone in that remarkable country. The university has a very long relationship with modern China. The first scholars from modern China came to this university in Australia in 1979. But in fact, at the time at which Australia opened diplomatic relations with China, there were already academics from the University of Sydney in that country who were able to celebrate with Gough Whitlam when he visited China as leader of the opposition. The university has a strong and a deep relationship with this remarkable place. We have, I think, it would be fair to say, a rather distinctive approach to China and to China studies. We don't tend to do grand geopolitics. We're not that interested, though of course we do it, in who loves whom at this particular moment in the world stage. What's much more interesting to us, and the area of our particular expertise, is how China works. How do you have a health system, for example, that doesn't have general practitioners, that doesn't have a strong primary care system? How do you enforce contracts in central China? How do you work to deal with the problems of massive and quick urbanization? These are the sorts of questions that we are keen to work with the Chinese in thinking through as the core of our activity in China studies. But of course, all of that goes on amidst the endless Australian noise that's been around for 200 years, this odd sort of sinophilia and sinophobia of which we are schizophrenically aware about whether or not we should or shouldn't be afraid of China. Odd as that question may sound, we thought it was therefore worthwhile getting it out on the table today and having this debate. And I'm very grateful to the two speakers for coming along and presenting the two opposing arguments. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, if I could ask Dr. Ming Lu, my colleague at the China Studies Centre, who will be the chair today, and for the other two speakers to come up. But before I pass over, just to thank the Sydney University Students' Union for their help and support today as we're doing this in partnership with them. Ming Lu.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I was told to chair this event. I will try my best to do an okay job. I will try to be strict with our speakers, and hopefully we'll be able to finish for people who haven't had lunch to go for lunch. Thank you all for coming again. Today we all get here to talk about this country that is the most heavily populated in the world. That is one that has gone through a lot of rapid and drastic changes over the last 30 years. As a major player in not just the region, but also in the world, I reckon anything that China goes through, any changes it brings would pose a great impact on the world. So here we are, we're talking about our country's most important trading partner and one of our most important regional neighbors. So is China's rise a threat to us? Is it an opportunity? Should we welcome China? Should we be afraid of China? And who, if there's anyone afraid of China, who these people are? We hope this debate will allow all of us here to better understand China's rise and its impact on us. And also in the future, when we have to deal with China, we will probably develop a more comprehensive perspective towards China. And before the panel discussion starts, I would like to thank a number of organizations that for their assistance in organizing and publicizing this event. So these organizations are the University of Sydney Union, the Australia-China Youth Association, and the CRCC Asia. And now let me introduce today's panelists to you. Our first panelist, Dr. Zhang Li. Dr. Zhang Li is an adjunct associate professor and the Michael Hinter Fellow for Energy Security at the University of Sydney's Center for International Security Studies. He is also a non-resident senior scholar at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and a member of the board of directors of the Kokoda Foundation. He frequently appears as a media commentator on major international television and radio networks, and he is one of the only handful of Australians to ever have been invited to formally testify to the U.S. congressional committees. He has published numerous books and articles covering energy security, China's foreign and economic policy, and global responses to China's rise. Please, Dr. Zhang Li.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chen, for that very kind introduction. I also want to thank the Vice Chancellor for his time, Kerry and the Chinese Studies Centre for organising this wonderful event, and thank you all as well for giving up your lunchtime to hear what we have to say. Now, the byline of the discussion that we have today is the rise of China. Will a hungry new superpower make us winners or losers? Well, the obvious, or to me, the obvious and correct answer is that it's a combination of both. The big winners of China's rise are first and foremost the Chinese people themselves, who now have opportunities that their parents and grandparents would not have imagined. But of course, as you all know, China is now the largest trading partner of almost every major country in Asia. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and of course Australia. China is also the largest trading partner, the largest Asian trading partner of America and India. Now, China basically kept us out of economic stagnation, perhaps even recession after the global financial crisis. So the benefits of China's rise are obvious and very clear and very real to all of us. But I think the threats posed by China's rise are also very real, but they're not so obvious. The threat arises not necessarily because there is something inherently sinister or intrinsic to China, to China's rise. It occurs because we are experiencing the disruption that always occurs when there is a rise of a great power in an international system. Now, let me explain with a metaphor of the international system why I think this is the case. The best way I can do that is to paraphrase an analogy given by an American writer, Robert Kagan, who published a book in 2003 called Paradise and Power. Now, imagine, and take this as a metaphor for the international relations system. Imagine that you are trapped in a forest. And in this forest, there is a bear. You know there is a bear prowling about in this forest, looking for prey. Now, if you are a small or middle power, you are like a man in the forest who is armed with a knife. And only having a knife, the man is most likely to decide that he is better off lying low, perhaps climbing a tree, and hope that the bear never finds him and that the bear never sees cause to attack him. Now, consider the rise of a great power, a genuinely great power like China, which is comparable to the same man in the forest, but this time he acquires a rifle. This same man, armed with a gun, a rifle, will make a very different calculation. The bear, over time, becomes an intolerable threat. The man, rather than hiding up a tree, will now choose to hunt the bear, to kill the bear, and to find a more permanent solution to his insecurity. Now, this is all very well, but let's give some real-world content to this analogy of the international system. Every great power tells itself that its rise will be benign and not disruptive. But the reality is that, like a man with a rifle, great powers tend to use force or the threat of force to secure ever-expanding national objectives. The European colonial powers did it, as we know. America did it, Japan did it, and now China is engaging in the most rapid military build-up in peacetime history. Now, this is despite a geopolitical situation where its sovereign territory is more secure now than at any time when the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. Now, like every great power, China wants just a little bit more as its power grows. Up to and including the Qing dynasty, Chinese emperors fought more than 2,000 wars in the 5,000-year period. They did that to expand their territories, and this included hundreds of wars against Southeast Asian rulers, not just internal battles. Now, this is despite the myth of a permanent and static territorial imperial entity overseeing a benign tributary system. Now, to recreate the Greater China, that, as it were, of the Qing dynasty before it fell in 1911, Mao Zedong retook Xinjiang and Tibet in 1949 and 1950 respectively. China, as we know, is increasingly impatient for a return of Taiwan. More recently, China has elevated its claims in Japanese-controlled islands in the East China Sea, and over 80% of all territories or maritime territories in the South China Sea. They have elevated these claims to something that they are now prepared to defend by force. China's dispute with India over Arunachal Pradesh shows no sign of abatement. Even the Russians are increasingly complaining about Chinese territorial creep in the far eastern Siberian landmass. Now, you might argue very legitimately that China has good claims to these territories. You might argue also very legitimately that China feels fundamentally threatened by what it sees as an American-led military encirclement of its east and southeast borders. And you may also argue, quite correctly in my view, that China is re-emerging in a strategic, legal and moral order that it had no role in formulating. It is rising in an Asia, we have to remember, where every other major Asian strategic player, America, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Australia, India, are democracies. Now, all of these arguments are legitimate, but the fact remains that in seeking the re-emergence of a Greater China, in seeking the return of some of its core interests, the rise of a hungry China, as the byline puts it, adversely affects the strategic interests of every major country in Asia. In other words, China is rising with some understanding, but it is rising as an immensely dissatisfied power in Asia, despite its important and critical role in a region, particularly as an economic player. Now, do I have a solution to this dilemma? No, I don't. But in ending, I put it to you that it is much more fruitful to put these awkward realities out there in trying to avoid a catastrophe that may occur than it is to ignore what are troubling trends in the regional, in a region caused by the rise of China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Li. Now our next panelist is my colleague, Professor Kerry Brown. Professor Kerry Brown, as you all know, is the director of the China Studies Center of the University of Sydney and also a professor of Chinese politics with the Department of Government and International Relations. He also leads the EU-funded Europe-China Research and Advice Network and is a research associate at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy, part of SOAS, the University of London Oriental and African Studies. Previously, Kerry served as head of the Asia program at Chatham House and as first secretary in Beijing at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He has published extensively on the politics, history, and economics of modern China and Asia. Currently, Kerry is, I think, writing a book investigating China's newest generation of leaders. How exciting. Please, Kerry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Ming Lu, for introducing me. So I suppose I'm going to start with a quote from Catch-22, the novel by Joseph Heller. Relax, it's hopeless. What is going to happen is going to happen, and we are observing that. I guess it only means how quickly this transition of influence and power happens. But I suppose my key point today is we have been told exhaustively and endlessly by many, many different people that it's just about the economics. My argument would be that, in fact, the last thing it's about really is the economics. This is not only an economic transition, a transition of energies and powers to Asia and Asian countries with China at the heart of that, and those are issues that John has just really talked about, the strategic impact of that, but it is fundamentally a transition of power and politics, political power. So when we talk about economics, this seems to me to be a kind of very sort of sly way, I suppose, of actually trying to talk about the thing we should be talking about, which is a political transition. Most of the time when we are thinking about that transition, either as Australians or Europeans or Americans or Chinese or others in Asia, we are doing two things. We're talking about what we think is happening when we see new statistics about China being the world's second biggest economy, the world's largest exporter, the world's second largest importer, the world's largest holder of foreign reserves, all these things that have been exhaustively talked about. But we are also talking about our feelings about ourselves. We're talking about how we respond to this change. And unpicking those kinds of meta-narratives, those different sorts of narratives, has really caused a lot of confusion. We therefore have, I think, a lot of people, a lot of observers, a lot of political elites transferring their uneasiness, their feelings about themselves onto what they claim China is doing. I guess the more disturbing news, really, it would be good, in fact, if there was a unified, all-embracing brain in Beijing that had a kind of enormous strategic plan along the lines that John talked about or seemed to refer to. But I don't think it's so comforting. They don't really have full control, not only over the external situation, probably that least of all, but over internal and domestic issues. And indeed, as Linda pointed out at a talk she gave the other day, Hu Jintao's speech at the party congress last November, before he handed over power to Xi Jinping, he only spent 10% of that talking about international relations. The current power configuration in the world is unsustainable. That unipolar moment that happened in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union fell didn't really last very long, and indeed now we see a world which is fractured, but which we still have a very, very dominant United States. And that United States is often looking at what China is doing with a great deal of trepidation. It talks the language of engagement, but that is interpreted in Beijing as the language of containment. And so there are two kinds of paranoia that we see facing each other. There's the paranoia within Beijing of a kind of power which is encroaching them. Wang Hui in Beijing University a couple of years ago said the problem is that the borders of America come right to the borders of China because of its extraordinary set of alliances in the region. But also we have the paranoia, which is probably more tricky and much harder to really get a conceptual framework of those in Washington who are probably very, very fearful of losing their prowess and looking at a world in which they are much less dominant. The issue really is that we are, I guess, now in a very luxurious position because there is actually nothing we can do about this. It's going to happen. The unsustainability of the current system is pretty obvious, and all of that was prefigured in 2008 when the financial system that this had all set up, this particular political configuration, when that really, really fractured and pretty much shattered. From now on, I suppose, our strategy should be smart engagement. We cannot escape engagement. We've been talking about engagement for many years. We've been talking about engagement since the moment when China started the reform and opening up process in 1978. But now we have to think about targeted, structural, very, very strategic engagement, and we have to really, really think hard, because we are entering, as Stephen King, the chief economist of HSBC, said, an era of very profound competitiveness. That doesn't mean conflict, it just means that we can no longer live on the current kind of legal and political, economic sort of basis that we've lived before. We have to embrace a world in which decisions made by Indian and Chinese, in particular consumers, are going to fundamentally change our economic environment. They want the same things that we have had. They want the same kinds of lifestyles, and we have no moral or economic or other right to deny people that in these new dynamic economies which have produced so much growth, not only for themselves but for us over the last decade or so. What we really need in three areas, I think, are smart engagement in China's internal reforms. Those have been talked about exhaustively, but we need to support the creation of a strong legal infrastructure in China, because it cannot become a modern economy without that. We have to work very deeply with China on environmental and resource and sustainability issues. We have to have a common understanding of what sustainability means. We also have to look at much more effective ways of integrating China as a stakeholder in the international system. The big argument, the argument that many elites in Washington, in Europe and here go endlessly on about, is somehow that China has a different view of modernity and that we are going to somehow be usurped in all of that. But that debate, that question really is a really spurious one, because all of the main tenets of modernity, all of the fundamental drivers of modernity are things that China has accepted. It has accepted the global order, it accepted the WTO, it accepted membership of international organizations, it has become a stakeholder. What it's wanting now is a bigger role in those organizations, and we have to therefore embrace an activist China and a much more vocal China in ways in which we do not feel fearful. We are more sometimes victims of our own fear than we are really of what China actually presents to us objectively. Very finally, I suppose we have to talk about our objectives. What are our strategic objectives? I think that there are two very clear ones. The first is that we want, all of us, whatever country we're in, and whether we're in China or whether we're in Australia, wherever, a more just and sustainable international order. And therefore we need to create a common language for that. I talked about sustainability, but also global justice and the ideas of equity globally. It is an obscenity to have the kinds of income disparities that we have globally now, and therefore we have to work with China on a developmental agenda which not only meets its domestic agenda, but also an international one that we can engage with. But the second thing, I suppose, which Mr. Edgar Snowden has showed rather kind of vividly in the last few weeks, is this is a story with no heroes. Maybe we don't need heroes anymore. We don't have to choose the good guys and the bad guys. We don't have to choose those who we are pro and against. We are about smartly engaging with people who really do speak properly the language of internationalization, of international equity, of sustainability in ways which are good for people, rather than for grandstanding elites in each of these countries who seem to want to just make political capital out of their ways of speaking about some kind of objectified other. And therefore, in this era, which is more just and more sustainable with no heroes, I think we really can all ourselves sign up and be stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. And today's third panelist is Linda Jacobson. Linda is the East Asia Program Director at the Lowy Institute. Previously, she served as both director of the China and Global Security Program and senior researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Institute. She was also a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University in 1990, and she lived and worked in China for 20 years. Linda is a Mandarin speaker. She has published extensively on China's foreign and security policy, the Taiwan Strait, and China's energy security and climate change policy. Now the floor is yours, Linda.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. And before I start, let me say thank you to Professor Kerry Brown. Thank you to the Vice-Chancellor. I think this is a terrific event. I'm hoping that we're going to disagree a little bit more than we've heard so far, because otherwise I think we've sort of wasted your time for coming, and I hope I'm going to contribute to that. It seems that fear in the conjunction of China is the flavor of the week. This is the second event in 2 days that I've been asked to talk about who is afraid of China. I'm not sure that I agree, and now comes the critical part, after thanking the organizers, that we should use the prism of fear to assess China. Are we afraid of China because it's so big, because it's so different culturally, politically, because they've improved living standards so much and it's growing still at rather a rapid pace? Of course, I do share concerns about China being so big and continuing to improve its population's living standards because of the simple fact that it's going to use a huge amount of the global resources and probably continue to be a massive polluter. This, of course, will affect us all, and that's why, just to echo and to be in agreement with something that Kerry was saying, we do need to smartly engage with China. We have to engage with them in every which way so that we could possibly have an impact on the way they move forward, the way they develop, so that that path would be a sustainable development path. And I do agree again with Kerry that what does sustainability actually mean? We love to throw that word around. I think that we're seeing proof already now that the Chinese government realizes this. There's certainly an awareness of needing to strive towards sustainable development. I think last winter the dreadful pollution in Beijing could have been a tipping point, and actually preliminary analysis of the new policies coming out of the new government proves that point. I think that middle-class families in the long run will just simply not put up with the awful air and water quality. And of course the authorities know that. Now, having now dismissed this whole notion of fear as a way of looking at China, let me be slightly controversial before I make my one and last final point, which will be about competitiveness. I knew I'd be lost on this panel, and I pretty much knew what my colleagues were going to say, so I tried to think of a different angle. But just to be controversial, there were 2 points that I disagreed with Dr. John Lee on. John said that he feels that China is an immensely dissatisfied power, and I'm hoping that Ming Lu will allow us then in the discussion period to discuss that. And then the fact that China has elevated its maritime claims to the status that they are willing to defend them by force. I think at the latest Politburo so-called study session, where Xi Jinping spoke forcefully to begin with about maritime claims and China will never give up its legitimate rights, then went on to quote Deng Xiaoping that we do need to let the island issues rest and be resolved by future generations. And I think that's a very hopeful sign that we're not going to see China in the next few years resolve its very staunch and adamant claims by force. So those are the 2 things I immediately disagree with, and then I'll come to this final point in the remaining few minutes that I have. And it's this question of who's going to be winners and who's going to be losers. Innovation is what drives economies to new levels. We've seen that innovation produced the winners of the industrial revolution, the technological revolution, IT, telecommunications revolutions, and so on. If Chinese companies were coming up with new technologies and proving that they are acing out their competitors globally because of innovative new technologies and methods, I think we should probably be quite concerned that we would end up as losers. But this is not the case. Chinese are not the most competitive in the world, and Kerry Brown mentioned the term profound competitiveness, and quoting the HSBC chief economist. And I think we are in an age of profound competitiveness. I wrote a small book, Innovation with Chinese Characteristics, already 7 years ago. This was slightly after the Chinese government decided that indigenous innovation was the key to China continuing to grow, continuing its path forward, and moving to a completely new level in the global economy and to ensure future growth. And this was to be, the indigenous innovation was going to be the goal of all scientific communities and also companies. What has happened? It hasn't really taken off. China has continued to struggle with being innovative. Partly, of course, this is a legacy of cultural history. We can discuss that if someone wants to. It's partly a legacy of the one-party state. I think it's fair to say that an underlying question when we talk about innovation is whether a state in which freedom of speech is restricted, stability is placed at the very top of the government's priority list. Can this kind of a society transform itself into an innovation-oriented society? Can creativity and innovation flourish in an environment that ardently encourages people not to rock the boat, that constantly reminds people that we need to live in a harmonious society? How does a teacher in China encourage students to challenge authority in the science classroom, for example, when they simultaneously tell them that please do not question the rules that govern society? These are very complex questions, and of course there are no definite answers. But I do think that if China was being really innovative, and we'd see the competitiveness level of Chinese companies rise dramatically, then maybe even I would agree with the title of today's event. I think we are not going to see that before the political system transforms quite dramatically in China, and I think we should be much more worried about China not being successful in its modernization drive. That's something should all of us be thinking about. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Now I'm about to open the floor to questions. We'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. After that, I'll invite our panelists back to each give a brief remark. We don't have a lot of time left. Can I please ask you, if you have a question to make, to be very straightforward, come directly to your question and don't be too long. Okay, now the floor is yours. We have a question at the back over there.
Thank you. I'm Simon Marks Isaacs. Fear is generated from the media in many cases. How objective do you think the picture that we're seeing in Australia is from the media at the moment? And if you don't feel it's fully objective, how might that be influenced?
I'll be very quick. I mean, in the Australian case, I think most of the fear that's generated about China is largely it's about economics, right? It's about China overtaking everything. In that particular context, I think it is grossly exaggerated for two reasons. The first reason is largely what Linda said, that China is not overtaking the world through its innovation, through its capital, through in any economic industry, China is not overtaking Australia or the region. The second thing is that if you look, the great fear, for example, is about Chinese investment in Australia. I mean, if you look at Chinese investment in Australia, and I know figures are boring, but this is important. In cumulative investment of Chinese investment in Australia, it's about 19, 20, 22 billion, depending how you count it. You compare that to America, it's about 555 billion. Compare that to the UK, it's about 465 billion. So there's an element of scale there, which I think is being missed. And to directly answer your question, I do think the media is particularly responsible when it comes to fear, particularly of China as an economic entity.
Do you have anything to add?
I would completely agree, and I would even perhaps say it spills over, and this pertains to the media in every country. Let's not single out the Australian media here. If there's an incident at sea, it's the assertive China doing this and that, when in fact it's often the assertive China and the assertive Vietnam and their, for example, law enforcement agency boats, both of them behaving atrociously. But the media will certainly single out big, bad China.
Thank you. Ashley Townsend, Oxford University. The premise of the question and a lot of discussions on China's rise implies that China is strong and going to get stronger. But what if it goes the other way? And Linda just touched on this. Economic growth in China is slowing. Social discontent at local and provincial levels is rising on a range of different factors and reasons. The rule of law is weak, as Kerry pointed out. And in addition to all of that, you have a situation in the Chinese economy where consumers have good structural reasons not to spend more, so the economy is not rebalancing properly. How afraid should the world be that China, through weakness, might pose a risk either by lashing out or by climbing up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting exercise to think every morning Chinese leaders will get a security briefing. I mean, I guess any leaders get a security briefing. So what is it going to be about? And I imagine it'll mostly be about internal issues and different kinds of protests that might be getting out of control, and then about particular economic indicators and whether they're up or down, and then, you know, finally you'll get to the international relations bit, and it'll be a bit about America maybe, and then, well, how much are they going to be cogitating about Mr. Abbott and Mr. Rudd? I mean, I don't know. I mean, Mr. Xi, there's this guy called Mr. Rudd and this guy called Mr. Abbott. Who? I mean, you know, Mr. Rudd, you met him last year. He talked Chinese to you. Oh, God, yeah, I hope he doesn't get in. You know, I mean, they're kind of going to be thinking like that, aren't they? I'm not a voter here, by the way, as you can tell by my accent. I mean, the thing is we're in a devil's gamble here, because the extraordinary thing about the moment we're in is if China, as Linda says, fails, that is a huge problem for us. It's a problem for our supply chains, it's a problem for our growth, it's a problem for our geopolitical security. If China succeeds, it's also a problem because it will seek probably to get a more influential position with resistance from America and others, and the maritime borders are one of the more obvious areas. But why shouldn't its status be recognized? On international relations is often about, it's not really about logic or rationality, it's often about honor, fear, feelings, a sort of emotional geopolitics rather than a particular kind of rational geopolitics. And in many ways, China probably feels now that it deserves a status that it doesn't yet have, and no matter what its internal situation, it knows that appealing to its people, the Communist Party appealing to the people's emotional support for that quasi-religious idea of the Chinese nation is always going to be smart politics. And you also get that, I suppose, with Japan appealing to its own version of nationalism. So I suppose the bottom line is that these very different forms of nationalism, they were always there under the communist system in China, and they were there in other areas in the region, in Asia, in North Korea, in South Korea, in Japan. They're going to be very thorny issues to deal with so that people feel that their new status or their different statuses are recognized without getting aggressive and violent about that. This is a very complicated era that we're going through.
Just to go directly to Ashley's question, should we be worried about it? I've always wanted to point out that when we talk about China's rise, we should say if China rises. I mean, this is one of my pet subjects. We don't have time to go into them, but I think just about everyone in this room knows the immense domestic problems that China has. And as Ashley mentioned, we could well be entering an era of much slower growth, and China's rise will come into question.
Hello. Actually, I have two questions. The first of them is why China seems to be so resilient to political change? I mean, what is the reason why China is one of the last countries to democratize? I mean, it's among the last probably countries in the world, if we would exclude a few countries in some other places. The other question is, China will become the largest oil importer by 2017, according to some reports, the largest net oil importer. So how is that going to affect its foreign policy, especially, and its involvement in Middle Eastern and the Persian Gulf politics? Thank you.
First question, why haven't they democratized? I mean, to top of my head, I'll give you a couple of reasons. First reason is that reforms only began in 1979. I mean, if you look at the pattern of democratization in other East Asian countries, they took quite a few decades. The second reason is that I think there is a genuine fear in China, both by the political class and also the social classes, of chaos, because they remember what happened when China tried to do too much too soon. And the use of this chaos is often self-serving by the Chinese Communist Party, but nevertheless, I do think there is a sincere belief within the CCP and within social elites in China that democratization could actually mean chaos as opposed to progress. So while things seem to be heading in the right direction, I think there is little incentive to actually democratize.
Yes, I'd just perhaps add to that when you say, why has China been so resilient? And just emphasizing what John was saying about how short a period of time Chinese people have had even the most basic personal freedoms. So when you're providing a chance for your own life and your kids' life to improve economically, and at the same time improving the quality of life through these personal freedoms, the push has just not been there so far. But the question remains, when will that push really kind of go over the top? I mean, that's the billion-dollar question that none of us at this table can answer.
I should very quickly add, since my title is Michael Hinsley Fellow for Energy Security, I should try to answer your second question as well. Yes, China will become more reliant on Middle East oil than America over the next decade. What does that mean? Unfortunately, I think it just will reinforce the immense insecurity of the Chinese. Because if you look at the situation, the major thing that would fundamentally threaten China's energy security is not interdiction by American ships. It's actually unrest in a Middle East oil-producing country like Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, China has next to no capacity to actually determine or affect that scenario. So I think what you'll see, I don't think it will necessarily lead to a naval arms race or a naval race between America and China in securing sea routes. I think the Chinese will realize that there is actually very little they can do about oil security over the next decade.
There's a question from there and there and there.
Mark Skinner. Can I ask the panel to reflect on demography? China has apparently passed the Lewis turning point in terms of workers moving from the country to cities and the costs that occurs. And then China's ageing rapidly and is going to be old and fat fairly soon. What does that do for long-term security? It certainly opens some benefits for trade in the next 20 years and maybe for medical services. But what does the ageing do to the broader strategic issue?
I personally think that if you go, Ageing is, I think, in my view, the number one and number two issue for China beyond the next 20 years or so. You know, the next 10 or 20 years, I think China will still be quite, I wouldn't say a confident power, but it will still be quite a stable power, or economically stable power. If you look at the Asian demographics, I mean, first of all, in 20 years' time, they'll have a Western Europe-like Asian demographics. Second, as you probably already know, they'll be old before they get rich. Now, what will China have to do to respond to that and to the social catastrophe? A number of things, but one of the things they'll need to do is to effect a massive transfer of national wealth from the state-owned sector and the government sector into private hands, and that's very hard to do in an orderly way. The bottom line is, beyond the next 20 years or so, when the aging population really hits, and China is not prepared for it, I feel China will become much more self-absorbed.
My question is for Linda about the Sino-American relationship. Because America has long been calling China for taking more responsibilities in the international system and to be a responsive stakeholder in the international system. But on the other hand, it has been, constantly seeking opportunities to increase its military presence in the region. And do you think the military deployment action taken by the U.S. actually shows the sign that the U.S. shows a sign of distrust of China's commitment to peaceful development road and to cooperating with the U.S. and not to compete with it?
Thank you. That's a very important question. There is deep strategic distrust between the United States and China. There's no doubt about that. While there is very strong interdependency when we look at economics, several social factors, education, technology, cooperation, etc., you're not going to be able to escape the fact that strategically there is distrust between the two countries. And certainly the fact that the United States is emphasizing and strengthening its military presence in the region is due to distrust of China's promises to rise peacefully. Having said that, at this very point in time, I think we're seeing a rather positive relationship emerging yet again, because it goes up and down in cyclical spheres between the United States and China. One of the most important things that came out of both the Sunnyland Summit between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping and then the strategic economic dialogue was the militaries are back to speaking to each other. That's really important. Yesterday there was a long press release explaining many different details which had come out of the visit by a senior Chinese general to the United States and all the things that had been agreed upon. So there's a lot of positive movement, but the underlying reality is that there is strategic distrust. I think we can live with strategic distrust. In that way, I see the glass as half full and not as half empty. I think many of these questions with China is precisely that. What prism do we look at? Just one last anecdote. In the 1980s, when I had first gone to China, I had by a fluke the opportunity to meet someone very senior in the foreign policy establishment. And over dinner, he looked at me. I was quite young at the time. I was 29, though I probably was older than quite a few people in this room. But anyway, I was young compared to what I am now. And he said to me, remember, the U.S.-China relationship is never as good as it appears to be, but it's also never as bad as it appears to be. There is interdependence. Thank you.
Thank you very very much. Unfortunately, we can't take any more questions. And now I would like to give the floor back to the panelists. Just briefly, can each of you share a few closing remarks with us? In the same speaking order.
All right. Given that I agree with Linda on so many things, on so many issues, when she brings up a disagreement, I feel compelled to respond. So I'll do so in my 2 minutes. The first issue which Linda brings up is my characterization of China as a immensely dissatisfied rising power. Now, it's true, the argument put forward by both Linda and Kerry, that China has largely bought into global institutions. It's integrated international order, international diplomatic order. It's heavily integrated in almost every sense in the international system. So in that sense, it is not a Soviet Union, it is not a revisionist power. But I use the term immensely dissatisfied power in a strategic sense. And I would still maintain that strategically, China is an immensely dissatisfied rising power. And unfortunately, strategic issues, particularly issues over territorial claims, are probably the hardest kinds of disputes to solve in international relations, and particularly when it's between great powers or powers with backing by great powers. There is, I wouldn't say a high chance of war, but there is a much higher chance of war. So in that sense, I think China, in my view, is an immensely dissatisfied strategic rising power. The second thing is about Chinese interests in the South China Sea, etc. And yes, there is debate about whether China would use force. Its civilian establishment tends to say no, they won't. Its military, for example, in its defence white paper tends to say yes, it is a core interest, will defend by force. Now, no one knows. I still return to the issue of capabilities, that is, military capabilities. If your capability is rising, if at the moment you are being trumped by a superior capability, then force is really out of the question. But like the man who acquires a rifle, over time, if your capability becomes dominant, which I don't actually think China's will, but if it does become dominant, then I think the temptation to use force is much higher. But yes, it is an open debate what China would actually do in a territorial dispute.
I think, in a way, my anecdote about US-China relations could be my closing. I will just respond to the last part of John Lee's comments to say that I agree that maritime sovereignty disputes are much more difficult to resolve than land sovereignty disputes, and China has, after all, nearly all of its the ones that used to exist, it's resolved them with its neighbors. The one reason that I continue to disagree with John Lee on this is that the number one objective of Chinese foreign and security policy is to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power. They say it openly. It's in every work document of the last 5 to 10 years. And if China was to go to war over its present South China Sea maritime claims, I don't think the Communist Party would fare well in that. And that's why I don't think they're going to use force.
Great, thank you. Look, I'm not going to say anything except 3 final things. We didn't want you all to come here today and then go away thinking, oh, there's nothing we can do. You can do 3 things. The first is, obviously, join us. Leave your contact details so you can be involved with the work of the China Studies Centre. That would be wonderful. The second is we do a Master of China Studies. You wouldn't get away from here without a little bit of a pitch, I'm afraid, and that's what we're pitching, a postgraduate degree, so it would be great if any of you are interested in deepening your engagement. But finally, I'd like to invite Luca Bankson, the Asia-Pacific Marketing Manager at CRCC, to come up and say a few words about internship possibilities. And if she could come here, then I will sacrifice my seat for her. Or you can, okay, right. Thanks. So this is Luca Bankson, Asia-Pacific Marketing Manager at CRCC. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kerry, first of all, for inviting me to be here. And thank you to the Student Union and Australia-China Youth Association for helping to put this together. I was already going to put in a little pitch for you as a what now, as an answer for what now. Most of you are already interested in Australia-China relations, or you wouldn't be here. And there are many ways for you to get involved from here. One, I was going to recommend, jumping in with the China Studies Center, looking at their study opportunities, and signing up for their newsletter, because they have great events like this all the time. Two, just a quick plug for ACIA, Australia-China Youth Association. Really good organization to get involved with on your campus, and they also do a lot of great events and advertise internships and job opportunities in China. And then, of course, with us at CRCC Asia, we run our own internship program in China for you to get short-term internship experience with our partner companies. So we run programs in Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Sanya. And if you would like more information, I think there'll be representatives from all three of those, so China Studies Center, ACIA, and myself and my colleagues will be standing at the table on your way out, and there's some information there for you. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, that brings proceedings to a close. I'd like to thank Ming Lu Chen for her excellent stewardship. I'd like to thank John and Linda for their perspectives today, and to thank you for coming. So thank you very much.